Almost everyone thought the man and the boy were father and son. They crossed the country on a rambling southwest line in an old Citroën sedan, keeping mostly to secondary roads, traveling in fits and starts. They stopped in 3 places along the way before reaching their final destination. First, in Rhode Island, where the tall man with the black hair worked in a textile mill. Then, in Youngstown, Ohio, where he worked for 3 months on a tractor assembly line. And finally, in a small California town near the Mexican border, where he pumped gas and worked at repairing small foreign cars with an amount of success that was, to him, surprising and gratifying. Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot was Stephen King's second published novel under his name, and what cemented him as a horror writer, even as his editor at the time wasn't sure if it was a good idea for him to get typecasted as such. It's also one of his few books that is completely spoiled by the cover, or worse, with the original Spanish translation that was La Hora del Vampiro, Vampire's Hour, before being renamed as The Mystery of Salem's Lot after the damage had been done. A 1979 TV miniseries didn't help matters, thanks to some very memorable scenes, and well, now Salem's Lot is known as that Stephen King vampire novel, despite the word vampire only being mentioned like 5 times, and the first one is around page 237 out of 427 pages. The prose tries really hard to keep the secret, but as I mentioned, everybody knows that Rosebud was his lead, or in this case, that yes, the mystery of Salem's Lot are vampires. And well, you just saw that the very beginning pretty much tell us that only a tall man and a boy will survive at the end. It is also one of the few early novels by King that didn't get the full movie treatment almost immediately. In 1979, as I pointed out, Top Hopper directed a 2-episode miniseries that was originally going to be a movie directed by George Romero. And here I ask for a minute of silence at that wonderful possibility, because in some other level of the tower, some very lucky constant readers got to see a Salem's Lot movie directed by George Romero. Talking about missed opportunities. Anyway, Tom Hopper did a fairly decent job with what he had, and later in 1924, Michael Solomon tried again with another 2 episodes mini. And while the 1979 created some immortal scenes that have been parodied and even flat out plagiarized by other filmographers, writers, and directors, and inspired other equally memorable moments in movies such as The Lost Boys, the 24 movie is better remembered as that rough low vampire thingy. So today, we are not going to touch any of those. My name is Adalisa Zarate, and today we are going to visit Salem's Lot as we continue exploring the dark and wonderful world of Stephen King. Before knowing that Carrie would change his life forever, Stephen King had begun writing Salem's Lot under the title Second Coming, which his wife rightfully pointed out that sounded like a really bad porno. Salem's Lot started as a weird experiment out of a casual conversation with Tabitha, another friend. King mentioned that if Dracula had come to the USA in modern times, or at least modern 1975, the FBI and the CIA would have had him in cuffs before his first victim was called. But the friend contradicted him and pointed out that, well, that would only happen if Dracula went to a big city. But in a small town, no one would be aware of what was happening until it was too late. With that little seed, King started creating the town of Jerusalem's Lot, that little typical Maine town full of life that slowly dies as the page turns until nothing alive remains on it. I think that Salem's Lot is unjustly named a vampire book. Yes, the main monsters are vampires, but it's also a haunted house book, the origin story of a haunted town. King gives a lot of deserved credit to The Haunting of House Hill by Shirley Jackson as one of his inspirations, and even quotes the book by comparing House Hills to the Manson House. So yes, it's a story about an urban legend. How an urban legend starts. What is funny is that on one hand, when you read the book, it's a very quaint postcard of how Maine was in the 70s. But at the same time, it's a story easy to modernize. I said that I was not going to talk about the miniseries, but it's very funny how the story almost doesn't change from the adaptation in 1979 to the adaptation in 24. Despite the advances in technology, despite the advances in society in some regards, the 1979 mini is incredibly white, while the 24 has a little bit more diverse characters. But other than that, the story and the actions are pretty much the same, which is quite appropriate because ghost towns do not change. They are frozen in time, and that's what makes them fascinating and dangerous at the same time. Maine itself, in real life, has had a bunch of towns go from a healthy population of more than 400 people to 26 in less than 30 years. We know and we can trace why that happened. No mysterious death involved, because it's mostly a combination of city growths that tend to absorb the smaller communities. There is also the fact that young people leave for other cities and towns because they don't like the stagnant life in the small town. Industries die, technology advances. Some towns get gentrified and become tourist traps, and that makes it really hard for people to live there if they are not part of the tourist industry. So yeah, sometimes people die, and that helps for the towns to die too, but most of them just get abandoned. Most people just leave, which is actually one of the excuses we are given in the novel as to how no one important ever noticed that Salem's Lot suddenly just went poof in a way. Runaways, people forgetting to leave a new address, young people getting bored. Whatever happened in the town could happen anywhere. Sure, it was sudden enough so that a couple of newspapers mentioned it. People with no money, people with no job could just pack up and leave. But why would the town doctor suddenly be unreachable by phone, card, emails? Well, not emails in the 70s, but you get my idea. The town librarian, the town sheriff. Yeah, that's funny, that was weird, that was quaint, but the articles were only to fill out pages in slow news days. Nowadays, it would probably merit a couple of YouTube videos, couple of quite interesting conspiracy theories, but other than that, no one would notice. I am actually looking forward to see how that is going to be tackled on the 2021 movie that we are promised. It's already in production. Maybe, we don't know. We are living in the stand. Another chapter we are going to touch another day. So I don't know if they are still working on that. Anyway, as I said, it's something that happens every year. Sometimes it is quite noticeable, gentrification we call it. And in that sense, I know that there are people who have called gentrification and the agents of it vampires, because it's like a play. You start with a Starbucks in the corner, or in this case, an antique store for the tourists to find quaint thingies to buy. And then you get the Starbucks on the corner, and another Starbucks in the corner, and then a McDonald's, and probably a frozen yogurt place. The little corner shop where you buy your groceries suddenly mutates into a Target or a Walmart. Here in Mexico, we tend to joke that if you drop your coffee on the ground, it will sprout either a Starbucks or a 7-Eleven. So yeah, it's very easy to say Starbucks are like vampires. However, that is not the angle that Salem's Lot takes. And that's very funny. What kills a town is not the modernization of Salem's Lot. What kills a town is the inability of the people living on it to accept change, to accept modernity. What kills Salem's Lot is nostalgia. Okay, so I know that is a weird take. I just spent a lot of time rambling about how a certain coffee shop that I just mentioned like 10 times is like a vampire, because once it infects your community, it's going to keep going and going and going. And now I'm saying that no, it's modernity what is good in the book and nostalgia what is bad. But the thing is, nostalgia is not tradition. Nostalgia and stagnation can be, deadly. And that's what happens in Salem's Lot. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, I suppose I should tell you what Salem's Lot is about, although as always, I strongly recommend you reading the book. I know it is quite tempting to use this kind of summaries or movies or miniseries as a replacement, because modernity! But in this case, the old ways still work. Trust me, Nothing compares to reading the book. It's very, very rare that an adaptation is better than the original. So, what is Salem's Lot about? Short version, vampire comes to town, writer tries to kill vampire wins. Sort of. Long version, Ben Mears returns to the town of Salem's Lot for the first time in 20 years. He wasn't born there, but he spent a significant part of his childhood in it. Back then, trying to impress some older kids, he had entered the local haunted house, the Marston House, which looms over the town in a hill, and thought he saw something. Now he's planning to exorcise the ghost of his past by writing a book about the house. His plan is to rent the house, use it as an inspiration, and convince himself that the house is not evil, despite of what he thought he saw. But when he arrives to town, he finds out that the house has been sold to someone else, to a couple of complete outsiders. Still, convinced that he has a story there because the house has a colorful story. A couple of killings happened there, and he suspects the house had a lot to do with a bunch of disappearances. He decides to stay in town, meets a girl called Susan Norton, and despite the fact that the girl's mother and totally hates his guts, starts a romance with her. So far, quaint little town. But as everybody who makes fun of Stephen King says, then evil came. In this case, evil comes in the form of two children disappearing. When they were going to a friend's house, it is one of the things that is weird now reading, both in Carrie, Salem's Lot, many of the older books, when you see kids being left alone by grown-ups and no one worries about them until hours pass. That doesn't happen now. So the kids, Danny and Ralphie, disappear and are searched by everybody in town, despite the fact that obviously the sheriff suspects the outsiders, because everybody knows everyone in town, so no one could do something horrible to them. The older, Danny, reappears, half anemic and delirious. The younger, Ralphie, is never found. As I mentioned, Ben is a suspect, and so are the new owners of the master house, the enigmatic and unseen Barlow and his partner, Stracker, but the local police doesn't seem to be able to find anything against them. The local police are not very good at their job. And then things get really bad, because Danny dies, and that starts a chain reaction of deaths, sickness, and disappearances. Ben, Sue, and Matt Burke, a local high school teacher, start suspecting that there's maybe something not completely right about it, while Mark Petrie, a classmate of the dead Danny, finds out immediately that Danny has turned into a vampire when Danny tries to drink his blood. So it's up to them, the local doctor Jimmy Cody, who has the not so nice job to treat the anemic patients before they die, and the local priest, Father Callahan, to try and stop the evil before it destroys the town and escapes beyond its limits. In a way, Salem's Lot is three stories in one. The main story is the brave and valiant vampire hunters who are trying to save everyone, despite the vampire being literally 4 steps ahead of them most of the book. It is the story of the town and its secrets, and it's the story of the Marston house. Unfortunately, the later two are just told in parts. They are quite interesting, they are quite intriguing in their own, but we only find bits and pieces about it. It's a trick that Stephen King will master later, because as Jerusalem's Lot is the first one of his small main towns. He will come to that well time and time again. Vampires, as I mentioned, didn't hold much of his attention. They only reappear in small short stories. But the secrets, the evil that can lurk behind closed doors in small little towns where everybody thinks they know everyone, that would come back and again and again and again and again, and every time he managed to make it a little bit different. At first, the secrets and evil in Salem's Lot seem small, trivial, evil, with lower caps, as Father Callahan considers it at some point. On one hand, we have a young mother who loses her temper and hits her baby quite nastily, and then cries about having hitting him, because even if she is abusive, she still loves him. Couple of affairs, among those a man who is quite violent with his wife and threatens to kill her lover. Teacher who likes to dress in female clothing and may look at the kids a little too long, because back then casual homophobia and casual transphobia was not something that people would actually notice crazy old woman who spies on everyone and tells everybody about everybody's business, local drunk, things like that. At first sight, Salem'S Lot is a town where you can raise your kids and live happily ever after, as long as you mind your own business and don't make any waves. A town that will keep your secrets, even past your death, as long as no one tries to make any change to the outward status quo. And one would think that in such a town, when everybody knows everyone and there are no locked doors most of the time, a high number of deaths would be commented on. But thanks to King's narrative tricks, we are privy to the thoughts of not only our main characters, but also random people as they are targeted by the ever-growing number of vampires. By letting us know most everyone in town, we end up caring for them. We are involved in their non-supernatural lives, and thus when they fall victims to the evil with high caps, then we mourn. I'm aware that for some people this particular narrative trick is a little bit annoying. You want to get on with the story and not worry about that kid who doesn't want to go to school because he thinks he's never going to use math in real life. Who cares about that when there is evil to be found? But if we don't know how Sandy Douglas hid her baby out of frustration, which is quite rare in 1975 for a book to admit that women could be as abusive as men to their children, then the later scene when she finds her baby dead would fall flat. Without that heart-wrenching moment, the even later scene when Dr. Cody and Mark find the whole family vampirized and hidden away would completely lose its punch. If we don't witness Charlie Rhodes being an asshole to the children that ride his school bus, then his later demise would be not as memorable. It's one of the creepiest scenes of the book, and it would have been a complete loss to miss it. If we don't know about Sue's struggles with her mother, then we don't understand why it's so important for her to leave town to prove herself to Ben, even if she just met him a little while ago. Without that time devoted to the town, we wouldn't even know that years before the action started, the Marston house was already house to evil. As I said, there is a third book there, a whole written book about Harvey Marston, the creator and architect of the house, and his crimes, that we can only imagine through bits and pieces that we get, that he probably was working for the mob, that he had been arrested once in a different town because a child had disappeared, that he most surely had correspondence with Barlow before Barlow was even named Barlow, and that he may have been part of a Stanley cult and involved in the disappearance of many children. We know some stuff for sure thanks to Ben's investigation and obsession with the house. We know how he killed himself, and we know that Ben thought he saw his ghost years after the actual event, but we don't know the whole story, and we wouldn't even know what little we know if we didn't have time dedicated to the town instead of to the vampires. And as I mentioned, it is also why, despite the modern changes made in the 204 miniseries, like the inclusion of emails, cell phones, and some extra commentary on people's sexualities, the tone remains the same, because just as us, the director, the screenwriters, got to know the people, got to care about them, and decided that they wanted to show us the people. Sure, well, actually, a very good example of this is the 1979 miniseries, because there, due to limitations of time, they could short pretty much every single external character and put the ones that they need there together into just one amalgamation. Like, for example, Sue's father suddenly becomes a doctor, and the real estate agent is also the guy who's having an affair with a woman, because they are in a hurry to get to the big parts. And while the big parts are quite memorable, I don't think a lot of people remember the actors of the other characters. The 204 tries to give us those characters, becomes a little bit moralizing by introducing more affairs, but in the end, we can get it the same town, the same feeling. And yes, as we watch both series, we get a little nostalgic about our childhood. Nostalgia, and that desire of everything remaining the same, is how Barlow gets his victims. He promises the people in town that they will get what they want, which is something they already have but they are losing. For example, in the case of Ann Norton, he pretty much promises her that her daughter will always be under his wing, so she obeys him even before becoming a vampire. He likes likes things orderly, quiet, and dead. But the fearless vampire hunters are the ones who fight that. They want to keep things alive. They want to keep things changing. And their relationship to the past and the present has a little bit of consequence in how they end the story. For example, let's start with Sue Norton, the only girl of the group. She's never officially a vampire hunter. She lives in the shadow of her mother, Anne, because her mother has her whole life planned. She had a local boyfriend, Floyd Tibbetts, but soon realized that she didn't like him that much. Not that Anne cared, because Anne Norton kept inviting Floyd to the house and kept him completely updated on what Sue was doing with everyone. She's also a very progressive woman for 1975, because she's the first one to approach Ben when she sees him and recognizes him. She decides that she wants to date him before he even asks any question. She initiates their first kiss, and she's the one who quite frankly tells him, I want to have sex with you. She is the image of a modern woman because she doesn't like tradition. She doesn't care for what they will say about her. And she's completely ready to pack her bags and go back to New York, where she tried once to get some success, because she is the most modern character of the Fearless Vampire Hunters. She is also the most resistant to believe that there are vampires. She is the cool, logical head of the group, and she tries to figure out every single possibility that would account for the deaths and not include, oh yes, undead blood-sucking creatures, which is why she gets frigid quite early. She tries to go to the Marston house alone, and she meets her end under Barlow's fangs. I will defend many of Stephen King's female characters in the future. Sue is not one of his best. But here we go. She is modernity without the leash of the past, without the caution of tradition. So she dies, and she's actually the first one to die. Then we have Matt Burke, the old teacher, who happens to be the Van Helsing of the group, while Sue is both Ormina and or Lucy. One would think that Matt will be the survivor because he is A, the oldest, B, he doesn't involve himself in the direct fight because a heart attack put him in the hospital for most of the book, and he surrounds himself with every single book about vampires he can find. He has knowledge on his side. The problem is that not only he tends to jump to conclusions really fast, I mean, seriously, there are like 4 deaths and Matt is already going, there may be a vampire in town, which is confirmed when a vampire comes to his house. But that tradition doesn't help him either, because while Sue was modernity without the past to hold her back, and thus she became foolhardy, Matt is tradition without the drive of modernity to go forward. So he is unable to actually face vampires without getting heart attacks. It is a little bit sad, the fact that first we are told that he remembers most, if not all, of his students' names, and he dies while talking to one and not quite remembering what was the name of this last student. So yeah, he dies too. Modernity without the past dies, the past without modernity dies. Then we have Father Callahan, whom I completely adore. I will not lie to you guys, Father Callahan is probably one of my favorite characters, not only in Salem'S Lot, but in the whole of Stephen King's work. He toes the line between nostalgia and modernity. On one hand, he longs for those days of the past, where the church he represents fought real evil, and not the moronic evil of the present. He thinks that corruption, domestic violence, and affairs are small things that should be easily solved and would not need the fate or the claw to actually be solved. But in the past, priests fought real demons. He still thinks that, for example, the things he saw in Vietnam, those were real evil. And he understands that the church needs to change, needs to deal with the new evil, needs to understand that not all they condemned in the past are sins. He even went as far as to write a whole treatise about how sin had changed, and then changed his mind and never published it. He wants to be in the modern times. He wants to be in with the young priests who want and try to make the world a better place, even if their faith wavers a little bit. But he also wants to be with the old priests who have no reason to doubt their faith. And this inability to actually commit to one side is what makes Father Callahan fail. In one of the best scenes of the book, he has the chance to put his faith against Barlow's, the white against the crimson. And when he can't put his faith where his mouth was regarding the modernity of the church, that's when he fails. He doesn't die, which is also interesting. The character character in The Edge survive. Unlike Jimmy Cody, because Dr. Cody is to Father Callahan what Sue is a little bit to Matt. He represents modernity. He represents modernity just like Sue. He's the doctor, he's a scientist. But unlike Sue, he's also willing to accept that sometimes crazy stuff can happen. At first, when he is approached by Matt and Ben about vampires, his first thought is, okay, I need to call the psychologist. However, he is willing to admit that anemia is not contagious, and it's definitely not as deadly as it has been in Salem's Lot, so he will accept to check on the parents of the Glicks, Marjorie, and when he finds out that Marjorie died, he decides, okay, you and I, you, Ben and I, we can stay all night with the dead body, and when we see that I am right, then we move forward with the psychologist. This doesn't go his way, because Marjorie gets up. And unlike Matt, Jim acts quite rational. He uses his knowledge in medicine to cure himself from a bite. And he goes like, okay, I think I get how this happens. I would love to know how they work, but first we kill them, then I investigate. But again, just like Sue, he lets his desire to advance to get the best out of him. Despite the worry that Matt had before dying, despite the warnings that separating the group is a bad idea, he decides to go on his own to check a hunch, and then he dies. So again, not stopping to accept the lessons of the past can be deadly, but remaining in the past is deadly too. You may be asking, well, Ada, that sounds very interesting, but you haven't proved that there is a balance. Well, there is one. The tall man with the black hair and the boy. Mark Petrie is the youngest of the fearless vampire hunters, and the very first fully heroic child in a Stephen King book. I am a little bit angry at the minis here because they both present him as a teen, probably 15, but in the book he's 12. Very smart 12, but 12 nonetheless. He loves horror monsters. He collects old Aurora plastic models that he makes and paints himself. He understands death. He understands bullies. And he loves to learn about the past and how things work. Unlike the others, he doesn't put 1 and 2 together to get 3 about vampires, but instead he faces Danny Glick, recently risen, out of his window and fights him off with one of the plastic crosses of his models. In a way, he's a prototype of the Losers Club from It, because his reaction to child-eating monsters is not to cower and cry for help, but instead he makes 2 stakes, steals his father gun, and then goes straight into the master house in order to kill the vampire. It doesn't quite work that way either. However, he managed to survive thanks to his wit, thanks to stopping to think what he's doing instead of acting right away, and while he knows that most of the grown-ups are not going to solve the situation, when he learns that there are some that know that there are vampires, he tries to find them. In a way, he is the perfect foil, the perfect opposite of Matt Burke. He is the youngest, while Matt is the oldest, but Mark is also ready to act immediately, while Matt wants to have a whole plan. And finally, they both face a vampire on the exact same night, but Matt suffers a heart attack, where Mark survives unharmed and goes back to sleep, forgetting all his fear once the window is closed. So here we have the balance. The child who learns about history, but is not going to let rationality stop him when he knows something crazy is going on. And finally, we get to Ben Mears, who is also the first of one of King's most classical characters. The writer who ends up, for no fault of his own, involved into some supernatural shit that may or may not end his career and his life. I will have to say a lot more about this in another time. But for now, Ben is going to the past in order to move forward to his future. Before the book starts, we know that he lost his wife in a horrible car accident, and he hasn't been able to write since. He remembers the 4 years he spent in Salem's Lot with fond nostalgia. His sound, the people he met, his friends, even the master house, even as it terrorized him, even with his horrible nightmares. So he goes back, and he even chastises himself, telling himself that he is doing something stupid, the tone is not going to be the same, things must have changed, he should not be blinded by nostalgia. And that is what makes him so perfect to figure out what's going on. Because yes, he went to town wanting to recapture his youth, but because he's still an outsider, he's able to see what's wrong. He's able to see past the idea of this is all the same and go, wait, his relationship to the town is quite stranded, but his memories are clear enough to help him make some friends and really feel bad when they start dying or disappearing. This is in part, this balance, the way that he wants to move forward, but at the same time don't lose his past, is what makes him want to save the town. He wants to save his childhood. This is what gives him faith. This is what gives him power. The perfect balance between nostalgia and the future. He wants to preserve the past, but he wants to move on with his life. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in contrast, Barlow the vampire is static. He dislikes change. He uses nostalgia as his weapon. Yes, he goes from an old gentleman to a young man as he drinks more and more blood, but his mannerism never changes. At one point, he boasts that he is older than Christianity, and thus he has everything clear to him. He knows everything there is to know, and thus he can always be ahead of the vampire hunters. His pride is what makes him fall, because he's so sure that he knows everything, because he's old, because he knows the past perfectly, that he's unable to see what would happen if a human could find his lair, if a human could find a way to kill him, if a human went past his human keeper. At the same time, he never sees how this tradition is a weakness. I mean, he cannot even come to town if he's not invited, let alone people's houses. And he doesn't see that as a weakness. Sure, he got invited by Hubie Masters, maybe, and he needs a stalker to destroy a lot of things that could kill him that are in town, that go from garlic to roses to dogs with spots over their eyes, yeah. But he still thinks that makes him more powerful than the human. And I don't know about you, but if you can be stopped by a flower, maybe you are not that powerful. By now, I hope that I made a case of how vampires are the comfort zone that can kill you if you get too comfortable there. They can be the past holding us back, even if they hide under a guise of modernity. Of course, as I mentioned at first, it's not the only reading Salem'S Lot offer by itself, or even adding later the 2 tales that King would write about the little town, but contained in the collection of short stories Night Shift. But if we went through all of them, we'd be here all week. So we're going to leave the lot for now. But let me know in the comments if you're interested in revisiting this ghost town, so we can get the stakes and the holy water ready. I want to thank my dear patrons, Kaiser Carranza, Mitch Hyman, and Elaine Ho, as well as my first supporter, Tanya Pineda. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here in the credits, you can do so at patreon.com/Adelisa. Written link on description, because I know my name is a pain in the ass to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos personally and get access to a ton of art before anyone else. If you can't support me in this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, comments so that the algorithm catches engagement, and of course, you sharing the links. I will also welcome all your questions, comments, and suggestions in the comments below. I'll see you next time when we book a room at the Overlook Hotel and see what secrets it holds.